Claire Bennett stood outside the house that used to be hers, a folder of documents pressed to her chest, while a black car idled at the curb. 6 months earlier, none of this would have made sense to her. 6 months earlier, she had everything she needed and nothing anyone could take from her. Now she was standing on a sidewalk in Millbrook, Ohio, watching a car she didn't own wait for a decision she hadn't made yet. To understand how she got here, you have to go back to the morning she said no to the richest man in the state. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone's history was on file somewhere, in someone's memory if not in a courthouse record, and Claire had grown up inside that particular kind of visibility. Her father, Walter, had been a fixture on Main Street for 3 decades, the kind of man whose handshake meant more than most contracts. And when he died, the whole town seemed to grieve him in shifts, one customer at a time, each with a story about something he'd fixed or fronted or forgiven. Claire had absorbed all of it, the store and the reputation both, without ever quite feeling ready for either. Claire ran Bennett Hardware, a narrow brick store on Main Street with a bell over the door that had rung the same way since 1987. Her father, Walter, had built the place from a single rented counter into a business that fed 3 families, including her own, before a stroke took him 2 winters ago and left the whole operation in her hands. She kept the ledgers the way he had, in pencil, in a spiral notebook, because the software always crashed and because some habits felt like keeping him alive a little longer. The store was profitable, barely. What wasn't visible from the register was the second mortgage Walter had taken out in his last year, the one Claire was still paying down, and the balloon payment coming due in 14 months that she didn't yet know how she'd cover. Her younger brother Danny was 2 years into a nursing program 2 states away, and half of every good month went to his tuition. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself a lot of things were temporary. Everyone in Millbrook knew who Nathaniel Cross was before they ever met him, because you didn't have to meet a man like that to know him. His name was on the medical wing at the county hospital. His face had been on the cover of a regional business magazine twice, always described the same way: self-made, private, unmarried. His family's company, Cross Industrial, had started 3 counties over as a mid-sized manufacturing outfit and grown, under Nathaniel, into something that touched half the supply chains in the state. Women who worked in his office towers talked about him the way people talk about weather systems, something enormous and far off that occasionally, unpredictably, changed the shape of your day. The foundation with his name on it had built 2 playgrounds and funded a scholarship. The hospital wing had his father's name, not his, which people took as modesty. Every visible sign pointed the same direction. Here was a good man, a rare one, exactly the kind everyone's mother had once told them to wait for. He came into Bennett Hardware on a Tuesday in March, in a coat that cost more than her monthly loan payment, asking for 4-inch deck screws and a post level. Claire didn't recognize him at first, because nothing about how he asked for what he needed suggested a man used to being recognized. He paid cash. He made a joke about the bell over the door. It was only when he handed her his card, in case they needed to order supplies for his property outside town, that she saw the name. She didn't change how she treated him. That was the thing that caught his attention, though she wouldn't understand that until much later. Most people, once they knew, adjusted something in their posture, their voice, the speed of their sentences. Claire rang up his screws and told him the post level was overpriced and he should try the 1-2 aisles over. He came back the following week for something he didn't especially need. The 3rd time, he didn't buy anything. He asked her to have coffee with him after she closed the store, and when she said she couldn't, that she had a delivery to make, he asked what day would work instead. She gave him a real answer, not because she was interested, but because it was easier than pretending she didn't have Thursdays free. Their Thursday coffee turned into a habit before either of them called it one. He never talked about Cross Industrial unless she asked, and she rarely asked. Instead, he wanted to know about the store, about her father, about the particular ache of running something you'd inherited rather than built. She found herself telling him things she hadn't said out loud since the funeral, and she noticed, without wanting to notice, that he listened the way her father used to, like the answer actually mattered to him. What happened next moved faster than she expected. 3 weeks after the deck screws, Nathaniel sat across from her at a diner outside town and laid out an arrangement instead of a courtship. His board wanted him married before the end of the fiscal year, tied to an inheritance clause his grandfather had written decades earlier and a shareholder vote that hinged on public perception of the family's stability. He needed a wife. He didn't pretend it was anything other than what it was. In exchange, he named a figure that would clear her mortgage, fund Danny's remaining tuition, and leave enough left over to expand the store into the empty unit next door. He said it the way a man reads a contract aloud, flatly, like he'd rehearsed it enough times that the words had stopped meaning anything to him. Claire sat with the number for a long moment. She thought about the balloon payment. She thought about Danny's tuition bill sitting unopened on her kitchen counter. She thought about her father's ledger and the years it took him to build something out of nothing, in pencil, on his own terms. She said no. She said it plainly, the way he'd made his offer, and she watched something move across his face that looked less like rejection than recognition, as though she'd confirmed something he already suspected about her, or about himself. He asked her why, and she found she didn't have an answer that satisfied even herself. It wasn't the arithmetic of the thing, though the arithmetic alone should have made the decision easy. It was some older instinct, something that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with the way her father used to talk about men who wrote checks instead of apologies. She told Nathaniel none of this. She told him only that some things weren't for sale and left enough money on the table to cover her coffee before he could reach for it. He didn't argue. That, more than anything, unsettled her on the drive home. A man like that, used to closing deals for a living, should have pushed, should have raised the number, should have found some angle. Instead, he'd simply nodded, the way a person nods at whether they can't change, and let her go. She didn't sleep much that night. Not because she doubted her answer, but because some part of her kept doing the math anyway, kept picturing the balloon payment gone, Danny's tuition paid in full, the empty unit next door finally filled with shelving instead of dust. She hated that part of herself a little, the part that could still be tempted by a number even after she'd already said no to the man attached to it. By morning she'd made peace with it. Some things cost something to refuse. That didn't make the refusal wrong. Word travels fast in a town the size of Millbrook, and within a week, everyone knew Claire Bennett had turned down Nathaniel Cross. Her Aunt Patricia called twice in one day, the second time in tears, asking how anyone in their right mind said no to that kind of money with a balloon payment coming due. Her landlord for the empty unit next door, a man named Roy Hendricks who'd been trying to buy out her lease for years, started returning her calls a full day later than he used to, and sometimes not at all. Then the offers started disappearing. The bank that had approved her small business line of credit called to say the terms had changed, unexpectedly, with little explanation. A supplier she'd worked with for 6 years suddenly needed payment up front instead of on the usual 30-day terms. It was hard to say whether any of it connected to Nathaniel Cross, and that uncertainty was its own kind of pressure because she couldn't tell if she was being punished or simply unlucky. But other things happened too, quietly, that didn't fit the pattern of punishment. An old supplier debt from her father's final year, one she'd assumed would follow her for a decade, was marked paid in full with no explanation from the vendor when she called to ask. A threatened lien from a contractor Walter had disputed years earlier simply vanished from the county records. She couldn't prove any of it led back to Nathaniel, and some nights she told herself it didn't, because the alternative meant he was still involved in her life in ways she hadn't agreed to. Roy Hendricks made his intentions clearer than anyone. He stopped by the store in person, uninvited, and suggested that a woman on her own, with a mortgage like hers, might want to reconsider selling the whole building outright before things got harder than they needed to be. Claire told him the store wasn't for sale, The same 3 words she'd used with Nathaniel, though she didn't tell Roy that. He left a card on the counter anyway, the way men like him always did, as if persistence alone were a kind of leverage. At night, she went through Walter's old ledgers looking for something she couldn't name, some proof that the debt she carried was survivable the way his had been. She found instead a name she didn't recognize, written in the margin of an entry from 30 years earlier, next to a number that didn't match anything else in the book. It was the first thread, though she didn't know it yet, that would eventually lead her to Earl Whitfield's porch. It was her father's old friend, a retired machinist named Earl Whitfield, who finally told her why the name Cross had always made her stomach tighten, even before she understood the feeling. They were sitting on his porch in April when he mentioned, almost offhand, that he'd worked at a stamping plant Cross Industrial had bought out in the early 90s, back when it was still run by Nathaniel's father. Walter had supplied parts to that plant. When Cross Industrial restructured the deal, the new contract terms had gutted the smaller suppliers, Walter's business among them, and it had taken him the better part of a decade to recover. Claire had been a child then, too young to understand why her father sometimes sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, but old enough to remember the fear in the house during those years. She hadn't been rejecting money at that diner table. She'd been rejecting the name that had once nearly taken everything from her father, offered back to her wrapped in a contract that asked her to forget. She spent the next 2 weeks with Earl, going through boxes in his garage and records at the county courthouse, piecing together what had happened to the stamping plant deal. A picture began to form of an aggressive buyout, favorable terms for Cross Industrial, and punishing ones for everyone downstream, executed under the elder Cross's signature. The name in Walter's ledger turned out to belong to a lawyer who'd represented 3 of the smaller suppliers in the buyout, all of whom had settled quietly within a year, all of whom had signed agreements that kept them from discussing the terms publicly. Earl remembered him. Claire tracked down his daughter, who still had a box of her late father's files in a storage unit outside Dayton, and who let her spend an entire Saturday photographing pages by hand because the unit had no outlet for a scanner. What she found there matched, almost exactly, the numbers already forming in her head. She brought what she'd found to Nathaniel directly, laying the documents on the same diner table where he'd once laid out his offer. He read them slowly. He didn't deny what they showed. He told her he'd been 11 years old when the stamping plant deal happened, that he'd learned the details only years later, piecing together his own father's history the way she was now piecing together hers. He said he'd spent the better part of a decade quietly making amends where he could, paying off old debts anonymously, absorbing losses no one traced back to him, because he didn't want gratitude. He wanted the record corrected without anyone owing him anything for it. It explained the vanished lien. It didn't explain, or excuse, the credit line that had mysteriously tightened after her refusal, and when she pushed him on it, his face changed again, the way it had at the diner the first time. He said he hadn't known. He said there were people on his board who wanted the marriage to happen badly enough to apply pressure without his knowledge, and that he intended to find out who. Claire left the diner that day without answers to everything, but with something she hadn't expected, the sense that Nathaniel was telling the truth, or at least trying to. It didn't erase what his father's company had done. It didn't erase the credit line or the supplier who'd suddenly wanted payment up front. But it complicated the shape of him in her mind, turned him from a name on a hospital wing into a man who seemed, in his own halting way, to be doing the same thing she was, trying to settle a debt that wasn't originally his. He called her twice over the following week, not to ask anything of her, but to tell her what he'd found on his end, a memo from a board member proposing that Claire's financial pressure be, in his word, leveraged to make the arrangement more attractive to her. Nathaniel said he'd confronted the man directly and gotten nothing but denials. He told Claire he intended to keep digging even if it meant digging into his own family's boardroom. And for the first time since the deck screws, she believed he meant it. The answer came from somewhere she didn't expect. Patricia, her own aunt, had been talking to a member of Cross Industrial's board for weeks, feeding them details about Claire's finances, her mortgage, her brother's tuition, all of it framed as concern but used as leverage to make the arrangement look inevitable, a kindness Claire simply hadn't been smart enough to accept. Patricia had told herself she was helping. What she'd actually done was hand strangers a map of every pressure point in Claire's life. The betrayal landed harder than the credit line ever had, because Patricia had raised Claire through the 2 years after her father's stroke, had sat with her at the hospital, had told her more than once that family didn't do this to family. Claire stopped answering her calls. The store's expansion plans, already fragile, collapsed under the weight of the tightened credit and the gossip now circulating that she'd turned down Cross's money out of pride rather than principle. For the first time since her father's funeral, Claire felt genuinely alone. She thought, more than once that week, about Roy's card still sitting on her counter, about how easy it would be to call the number and let the building go, let the whole complicated weight of it become someone else's problem. She thought about the balloon payment, closer now than it had been in March, and about Danny's next tuition bill, already due. She didn't call Roy. She wasn't entirely sure why, except that giving up the store now would mean the buyout that broke her father 30 years ago had finally, quietly, finished the job it started. She didn't wait for anyone to fix it for her. She called a reporter at the regional paper who'd covered the hospital wing dedication and told her the real story of the stamping plant, the buyout, and what it had cost families like her own. She didn't ask Nathaniel for permission, and she didn't ask him to defend himself. She wanted the story told on her terms, in her father's name, not as a footnote to a billionaire's redemption arc. When the story ran, it named Cross Industrial plainly, and it named the board members who'd used her financial pressure as leverage. Nathaniel was given a choice by his own board, quietly, in the days after publication. Distance himself from the story and let it fade, or confirm it publicly and accept whatever cost came with admitting his family's history. He chose to confirm it, in a statement that named his father's deal specifically and committed Cross Industrial to a restitution fund for the suppliers it had displaced decades earlier, Bennett Hardware included. The board members who'd pressured Patricia lost their positions within the month. Patricia never fully explained herself, though she left 3 letters on Claire's porch over the following year. Each one returned unopened. Roy Hendricks stopped calling about the building once the story broke, though whether that was decency or simple loss of nerve, Claire never learned and stopped caring to ask. The bank that had tightened her credit line quietly reversed the change without ever admitting it had been connected to anything, which told her everything she needed to know about how it had happened in the first place. Claire rebuilt the store slower than the original offer would have let her, without a balloon payment threat and without a name attached to the money. The restitution fund covered the original debt the buyout had caused, decades late, but it came without strings, and she took it the way she'd have wanted her father to take it, as an accounting made right, not a rescue. Danny finished his program without a break in tuition. The empty unit next door eventually became storage, not an expansion, and that was enough. Nathaniel came back to Millbrook once more, not with an offer this time, but with nothing to trade. He stood in the same doorway where he'd once asked for deck screws and told her he didn't know what he was there to ask for, only that he'd wanted to see the store still standing with her name on it. Claire didn't invite him past the counter that day. She told him he could come back when he had a reason that wasn't about her father's ledger or his own. What happened between them after that stayed mostly out of the papers, which was, for once, exactly how Claire wanted it. The same street, the same folder of documents. But this time, looking at it, Claire understood what it had actually been holding all along. What looked like loss on the day this story began was the turning point that made everything after it possible. The story was never about winning a billionaire. It was about what a hardware store owner named Claire Bennett refused to sell, and what it finally cost the people who thought she would.